welcome to Reify's online learning hub. Today, we'll walk through the steps of setting up a data source using the DataSource wizard, and then we'll learn how to create a list of specific values you can use within your data source. First off, let's get started with a new data source. Look for the Add Data Source button and click on it. With Reify, you can duplicate an existing data source, use one that's shared, or create a new one. Since we want to create a new data source from scratch, hover over New Data Source from the options provided. You can upload data from files like CSV, JSON, or XML to create a data source. But we will take a different route today and use the DataSource wizard. Pick Enter Fields in a wizard to get going. Now, every data source needs a name. In our example, our data source will store information on projects. Type Project into the ID field to name it. Let's add our first field by clicking Add New Field. We'll name this one Project Name. The type value indicates what kind of field it will be. Common examples are a date, number, or text field. The data source wizard then formats that field as appropriate. For this field, we'll keep the type as text. To add a second field, click Add New Field again. This field tracks the project status, so let's call it Status. The status field is a bit special. An enum type. That means it only lets the user choose from specific values we've set. Select enum from the type dropdown. Next, click on the Allowed Values list button. This window is where we'll define the allowed values for the status field. From here, we'll click to add allowed values to the list. Now let's enter the values for our enum. First, we'll type in not started and then hit the Tab key on the keyboard. Next, let's type in progress and hit the Tab key again this time. To speed up the tutorial, we have now filled in the rest of the values automatically. So let's click the Save button to save all of the values. You'll notice that we also added the rest of the data source fields. Note that the start and end date fields are of the type date. When these fields are used in your components, they'll have the special date format. We've also added some sample data to the data source. Remember, it's easy to create a data source with sample data in a CSV, XML, or JSON format if you have data that you are already working with. Now that everything's set, we'll click Save. Note that in the future, if you want to add more sample records to a data source by hand, you will just click on the Add New Record button. Moving on, we'll build a screen to use our new data source. First, we'll add a split pane layout. A split pane is a component that divides your screen into two sections or panes. This layout allows you to navigate through your content more efficiently. On a desktop or tablet, two panes will appear, but on a phone with less space, one single pane will be shown at a time. To get started, double-click the split pane component to add it to the screen. In the navigation pane, we'll show a list of projects. To do this, add a list grid to the pane and bind it to the project data source we just created by double-clicking on it. To make the list something you can edit right then and there, click the Can Edit box in the list grid properties. Now, let's take a peek at the field types we set up. Double-click a row in the grid to see them in action. Notice how our earlier settings, like the calendar for dates and a drop-down for enums, show up automatically. Let's add a form to the other pane so users can view and edit project details. Just double-click a table layout to add the form. To connect this form to your project data source, give the data source another double-click. Now we'll add one last detail to make our application more usable. Click on the split pane in the component tree. We will make the title of the detail pane change depending on what project the user is looking at. Any properties with a lightning icon can have a dynamic value. Click on the lightning bolt for the detail title property. We'll set the title based on the project name that is loaded into the form, so we keep the Value in Other Field radio button marked. Click on the Choose a Field drop-down list. Now pick the project name field from under the values for the form. And finally, we'll click the Save button to save our changes. Typically, when you want a list grid record to be loaded onto a form, you'll need to set up an action on the list grid to make that happen. But when you use the split pane layout, it expects the navigation and detail panes to be related. Because of this, you don't need to add an action to the list grid to have the data come up on the table layout form if the data sources used are the same or related. All right, now let's see our split pane in action. Click on the preview icon to view our screen as a user would see it. Click on a project in the list grid and watch as it pops up in the form, complete with the project title up top. Now let's look at the list of values for status field. Click the drop-down button to see the list of the statuses we entered earlier. These are the only values that can be chosen by the user for this field. Congratulations! You now have the know-how to set up a data source with the DataSource wizard and to create a list of values within that data source. With Reify's data-driven design, you can set up your data source once, and then all the data-aware components will use that setup. Just think of the time you'll save.
Reify is a new kind of low-code platform, one you can use on every project, not just for the simple ones. Reify is a radically faster, radically better way to work. Try Reify today for free.